Hey everyone, Margarita here. I'm back with part 2 on the different forms of Munchausen by proxy that my mother has. I know it's taken me quite a while to film these couple videos. It has taken me almost 2 weeks. I have tried to film this over 10 times now in total, and something keeps happening with the video, or I have to delete it and start over, numerous reasons. And it's just taking a really long time. Part of the reason for this is the fact that I have way more on my plate than I can handle, and it's been that way since the day of my injury in 2018, along with the ongoing chaos and crimes that my mother is behind. Long term, some of this is part of the Munchausen by proxy, and then it's also mixed with the crimes that she commits and the harassment. And the fallout of all of that long term is all still going on in every which direction in the current for me. Even if she hasn't done anything recently, this is so long term over the course of my life and what it's all led to decades in. It's led to serious permanent issues. And because I'm self-made, self-built, and I generate 100% of my own income, I've always had numerous things running. Even if something isn't producing income immediately in that moment, there is things that you have to do leading up to something producing income. So everything I've been working on, I have had planned 5+ years in advance. That's always been how I've operated since I was a teenager. So there's just so much on my plate, and part of the reason is part of the crimes, the Munchausen by proxy, the harassment, all of that plays a role in why it takes me so long sometimes to get these videos up, and because I'm chronically sick, permanently injured due to those crimes and that Munchausen by proxy. I know I don't look sick and injured, but I am. I live that way. It doesn't go away from the time I had the injury in 2018. The overload of carbon monoxide had flooded my system back then, and I stayed extremely overloaded for several years before removing the bulk load of it after going through hundreds of thousands of dollars in out-of-pocket treatment. It doesn't matter. The injury was so extreme. I'm still working on removing that initial overload, and I also have to remove additional exposures and particles that do not affect the general population because the brain tissue is open from the brain injuries from the carbon monoxide poisoning. That's an additional problem. It's a second layer of problems. Not everybody with carbon monoxide poisoning has that problem. Most people don't, not to that degree. So with all these additional particles and exposures I have to remove just to stay a little bit functional, just to keep everything running. It's all tied together because I run everything myself. And then with being chronically sick, permanently injured, those effects are still ongoing today from the overload in 2018. And I still have to manage removing the initial overload on top of any additional exposures. And because that all takes up about 50% of my waking life, me managing symptoms and removing the abundance of carbon monoxide from the initial overload and any new exposures takes up over 50% of every day of my life. So that does tie back to the Munchausen by proxy and my mother's ongoing crimes, because the initial medical emergency went untreated, and it causes all these problems in the current because of how sick and injured I am. I know a lot of people on TikTok, they, not that they say rude comments, but because they don't watch my story in order and because the platform is structured differently than YouTube, they either seem kind of confused, or because they watch different videos of mine, it's not in any type of order with playlists or anything. So people aren't realizing that I'm chronically sick, that I live suffering continuous effects from my initial medical emergency in 2018. That those are ongoing problems, and I live with ongoing symptoms every second of every day. I do have some periods now where I am sometimes symptom-free. It hasn't really been that way in over a year due to how I wasn't treating. I still require ongoing maintenance treatments at a bare minimum, and that stopped for over a year. So that caused a further problem and caused a decline in how well I was It's not a positive movement forward is part of the problem. Treatment has to be maintained. We still have to live modified lives. We can't intentionally expose ourselves to any particles, and we can't always be outside due to what's in the air. Like again, this does not affect the general population. So I talk about some of this in my other videos. Those are up on my YouTube channel. I don't believe I've released those to TikTok. But if you go to my YouTube channel at Againstalloddstruestory, you can view the different playlists there where it's easier to flip through the different subjects that I'm talking about, which are all intertwined at the very end of it all because it's all pertaining to my actual life. And you would understand what I'm talking about a little better. So I guess it depends on how many of my videos you're watching, but I had not been treating for the past week and a half to 2 weeks because I had so many tasks on my plate that sometimes I have to stop what I'm doing and address something fully for numerous days or even a week or more sometimes just to catch that section of my life up. And then because I have so many things going at one time, and because I built this life before I became injured, that's still what has to be carried out in order to keep my son and I alive, in order to build forward, in order to maintain our lives, in order to maintain income. That all has to be maintained as a whole, which is where I had things prior to the injury happening. So that's why there's long pauses in between me releasing some of these videos, because sometimes I have to stop what I'm doing, address this, and then stop and address that. I always have ongoing paperwork. I'm still addressing the over $100,000 in damage to my home. Everything is on a time limit. There are all these things that I'm dealing with at one time. And because I spend over half my time dealing with symptoms and managing those symptoms and removing part of the initial overload mixed with anything new we've taken in, that takes so much time. And then there's times where I am still incapacitated on top of regular daily tasks that regular people have. So there's long periods in between me filming sometimes where here I'm talking from 2 weeks ago, picking up on my video yesterday and today, trying to pick up where I left off 2 weeks ago. And it's hard for people to follow along, or they make in my comments on TikTok, they'll, just assume certain things because I'm sitting here talking or I'm not at a hospital. They don't understand the nature of what I've been dealing with and the condition, the injury, the effects, the symptoms. And yeah, I do have 5 brain injuries. So all of those factors play a role. I'm not always okay to film. I can't always talk well. I can't always deliver the information. Sometimes I have way more symptoms than other days. And I even look different from day to day in different videos. I could film a video today, one yesterday, one tomorrow, and look completely different in all 3 videos, just based on if I've had any exposures to any small amounts of carbon monoxide or any other particles. You can see, as a lot of these videos are filmed pretty close together. So that's just a short little explanation for why it's taking so long, especially with the people on TikTok who've not that they're rude comments or anything. It's just, I'm newer to this social media platform. And on top of it, they haven't watched enough videos to fully grasp what's actually going on. So it would help to go to the YouTube channel and flip through the different playlists and videos there. It's way better understood on that platform. However, I am still going to continue to upload all of my videos to both platforms. Okay, now that I've gotten that out of the way, I feel like I can talk a little better today than I could the past week. I was having quite a few issues, but where I left off is my mother poisoning batches of food. And so I talked about how she was giving my dad different batches of food to bring into my homes because she's never been allowed in any of my homes. That all started right when I turned 18 and I was in my own home right away. My dad wasn't coming to my home too often at that time, but when I moved to my second house, he was there almost every night. Just in passing, that went on the entire time I had my second house because they were in completely different locations. So when she began giving him batches of food to sneak into my house, it would be like donuts or something she made or It could be something that she didn't make, but she would add the poisonous substance to it. It could be something store-bought as well, and it wouldn't be a sealed package. It would be something that was already exposed to the outside air that somebody could have tampered with. I knew that. I didn't fully grasp it all until I was almost 30 years old, but it had been going on from the time I bought my own home at age 18, and it was going on all the way until my dad had his injury about 2.5 years ago. She was still giving him batches of food to sneak into my home, and for a period of time, I was saving those items, or at least taking a sample and dating it and freezing it, because that's what the private lab that I hired told me to do back in 2019 or 2020. I believe it was 2019. I started saving the samples back then because we had a lengthy conversation about why I was hiring the lab and what had been going on. And she knew that I was not making up anything that I was saying, especially because of the knowledge that I had on the subject. And that's nothing I've ever studied in school or anything. She knew that something to that degree must be going on, because nobody would just have that type of knowledge just out of the blue, acquire that knowledge. So I was saving all of those samples, or quite a few of them at that time. I did lose the majority of them between moving to my house in Ohio for 1.5 years and coming back. It was all very chaotic because of the harassment, the crimes. The reason I was forced away from my home was also due to my mother's criminal harassment and the Munchausen and the system reporting and the delusional phone call placing to all these agencies. That is why it was so chaotic and what had all happened during that time. It was very life-threatening, and she knew that, and that was the whole point. That's what she was trying to accomplish. She was trying to make sure I was not here anymore. So I did lose all of those samples during that time when I left and I came back. I do have, I'm not without, I do have a couple samples saved, but the majority of them were lost during those transfers. So if you want to view more on, because I know I mentioned in part 1, the videos pertaining to my mother contributing to my grandmother's death and the poisoned apple pie that she sent to me at Thanksgiving time, used her brother to get it into my house. And what I'm going to talk about, I'm just going to mention it briefly because I go further into detail in a different video. But I do believe there's a video on the YouTube playlist right next to the 2 I just mentioned. They're all 3 in order. The other one is more on my dad's injury and my mother's ongoing crimes, or something along those lines. Something to do with Special Tree. That's the care facility he's at, my dad's injury, and my mother's crimes. All 3 of those videos are in line with each other. And this goes further into detail in those videos on what I'm about to say right now. So it would be helpful to go watch those videos on my YouTube channel. So I talk more in depth about from the time my dad became injured at the end of January 2023 and the different stages along the way of how my mother was poisoning different batches of food of his. Once he became injured and he was at the care facility, he kept getting rushed back to the emergency room with sepsis settling in, or a couple times it was septic shock, and that was due to her poisoning the batches of food. That was his body's reaction to ingesting this poisonous substance, even though we don't know what it is, and I do believe it's more than one substance. That's his body's reaction since his injury happened at the end of January 2023. Prior to January 2023, so my dad wasn't eating the food that he was bringing into my house. She would cook separately for him and put it in whatever he was ingesting at their house. So all along the way, she was doing that to him. His body's reaction long-term, all these years prior to his injury, was repeated urinary tract infections. And then he did show up at my house with these funny looking welts, all different shapes and sizes that itch really bad. And those were all during times that he was either helping me work on my house or he was over here helping cut my grass. He was making my kids cut the grass, and then he was weed whipping. But she was very jealous that he did that. Also, I was near death the majority of the time that was going on, and I didn't have the ability to do that myself. But either way you look at it, my kids were doing the majority of the hard work. But on the times we were remodeling and redoing stuff in this house, that's when she would poison his batches of food, and he'd end up having to go visit his primary doctor either the next day or the day after. And it was over her jealousy and envy of him being over here working on this or that within my house. It could be something as small as changing out a light fixture. And that's what she was doing to him. So that went on and off the whole 8 years I've had this house. And once my dad had his injury, that's when his symptoms were no longer just a urinary tract infection, because he's now disabled from the stomach down and he had some significant injuries. The result when he ingests it now goes further than just a urinary tract infection. It then leads to blood in the urine. It leads to phlegm in the lungs, which then leads to pneumonia. And it then leads to sepsis starting to settle in. And then a couple times it led to full-blown septic shock. That was all her doing. It is the poison food. It's just that his body had a very extreme injury, and that's now the result of him ingesting it, versus all those other years where he was ingesting it. The symptoms didn't become that extravagant. It didn't make it so he was like in the hospital ever. It just made him have these symptoms that would cause some suffering. So if you go back and you view those 3 videos that I'm talking about, I believe I released them in March, I think. I could be wrong. It might be April. I believe it was about 6 months ago. So if you go back to those 3 videos I just mentioned, they're all in order. And it explains more about the different time periods of his injury, at least the first 15 months or so, of how he was rushed back to the hospital all these times. And each time it was her poisoning his food. And there was a very clear pattern of Munchausen by proxy. Even though I tried to notify different staff, here's my mother feeding them all delusions about me in the background. She would always be there in the daytime, and then I would be there in the evening time. And because we weren't there together, I'm not able to defend myself because I don't even know that I'm being talked about. But it was made very clear along the way that that's what was going on, that here she is feeding these people this false information about me, who I am as a person, what I have going on in my life. She's got these people, she slowly manipulated them and brainwashed them to believe this false narrative about me. So by the time I'm trying to tell everybody what she's been doing to him, they don't want to believe anything I'm saying, because she also knows that the substance she's using is not detectable. In order to get a hit, you would have to get the category of substances that it belongs to, or that exact substance. And I was already well aware of that from me hiring the private lab all those years ago. I was already well aware of that. So when hospitals check for these things, they're not going to find them unless that specific category of substances is checked for. So she's very confident that this substance is not going to be found in his system. So yeah, if you want to view more about the pattern of it all the time she tried to finish him off, the intent is to collect his assets and collect his 401k and whatever's left. That was her intent. And then I also did the video on the 401k fight that they had right before she made him go unconscious on 1/7/24. All these videos are kind of right in a row, right there together. It explains the situation much better, but there is a very clear pattern of the Munchausen by proxy. And because she managed to manipulate all of the different staff at the care facility and several different hospitals, that nobody believes me, because they're also not going to find it. And she knows that. And the people that work there aren't aware that the substances aren't going to be found. I'm only aware of that because I hired the private lab all those years ago. And then I seen it for myself once I knew that's what was going on and they're not getting results back at any of these facilities. I already knew how it worked. So if you watch those other videos, there is like maybe 5 or 6 of them that would kind of go hand in hand with this video and give a more in-depth explanation of step-by-step along the way of how he kept coming near death. And then he'd make somewhat of a recovery, and then he's slowly going further downhill. It was her doing it all along. And then I've also made police reports in advance of these things happening because I knew that's what she was going to do to him. So from the very beginning, it was already documented with the very first city where he was at that hospital, the very first one, their police department, it was already documented. So all those videos are already up on my YouTube channel. It explains everything. And again, prior to him having that injury, the effects he was having was nothing extreme to that degree, but it was enough to cause him some suffering, because that's what she likes to do. She likes to cause physical, mental, and emotional pain and suffering. And so that also goes along with the jealousy and envy, and how she's always wanted to get rid of me, on top of the fact that I was left this trust fund. And then when she found out I was near death from my injuries in 2018, here she was attempting to finish me off, so that way she would gain access to the rest of the trust fund. And at the same time, she was doing this to my dad once his injuries became very severe. She had intent on finishing him off. She was intending on taking everything from the both of us and running off and living her life in California as this fake rich movie star, as she always pretends to be. Except for she didn't work for any of what she's trying to take. So that's kind of what her plan was. And that's what she was trying to do to me all along, every step of the way. So that way she could, you know, carry these plans out, because I was injured prior to my dad, and she had intent to cause death with the both of us. So it does go hand in hand with the jealousy and envy, with the triggers of poisoning the food, and then with us still maintaining a relationship all these years, even after I cut her out at age 18. Even then, there wasn't a relationship between us prior to that. She wanted to make sure she drove a wedge in between us, and what she wants full control over the situation. And that's part of the reason for the lies and delusions, and her telling all these staff members all these things about me that aren't real, so they perceive me a certain way, and that way they would ban me from the facility from my dad, so that way she can create, you know, mental and emotional pain and suffering, jealous that we have a relationship, and that you know, that when I was born, like I was talking about in the last video, when I was born, he was the one taking care of me, not her. And she was jealous of me from the time I was born. And that's still the current situation. That's always been the situation every step of the way. So that's why she would poison his food when he'd be at my house working on things. And then once he became injured, here she was trying to get me banned from all these different facilities every step of the way. It went on for some months at many different facilities. This is what she was attempting to do. And she did that to drive a wedge between us, so I'd be banned, so we wouldn't be able to see each other, to create mental and emotional pain and suffering for the both of us. Still mad that I was born. And I'm 41. She's still mad that I was born. She never turned into a neurotypical mother. She never turned into a normal person. That's what nobody's been understanding. I've been trying to tell people this for decades, and no one's comprehending. She's not neurotypical. She's not going to turn into a normal person. She needs to be apprehended for her crimes. And I have told people this many different times over the decades. No one's comprehending what I'm saying, because they only see the fake version of her that she presents to the rest of the world, and they don't see the person that I've really been dealing with all this time. So that is part of the Munchausen and what is going on with that situation, and why I'm banned from my dad. However, I've been so used to this that this is my normal. I've been used to this going on for so long with those around me, and those are who are supposed to be closest to me. She has driven wedges between myself and my older two kids and my dad. And she tried like hell to make sure that those relationships were destroyed at the time my injury became extreme in 2018, and continued it on for a few years, attempting to destroy my relationships with all of them, repeating delusions to them the entire injury, because she had access to them, not me or not my home. But she was repeating delusions to them all during my injury to get them to operate against me. Repeating delusions about how I was never injured. I always had this mental disorder. What they were being brainwashed to believe, what they thought they were seeing within me was a mental disorder, not an extreme physical injury and numerous brain injuries. And at the same time, she was preventing treatment from happening within the traditional medical system to cause it to be that extreme, to cause the physical pain and suffering to be that extreme, to cause the injury to be more extreme. So she caused all of that. And that's, you know, she wanted to drive wedges in between each person who should be close to me. And she was successful at doing that with all three of them. So there is permanent damage with all of those relationships, and it's not repairable. It's never going to be 100% repairable, no matter how you look at it. And it's not going to be able to begin to be more repaired than where it is today without arrests being made and her to be apprehended. And that is exactly why she has never been allowed to have a relationship with my youngest child, who is 9.5. So yes, that all pertains to the Munchausen by proxy. Another thing I wanted to talk about when it comes to the poison batches of food is the fact that she was poisoning my food. Like I said, I bought my first house when I was 18, and I was still living at their house the majority of my pregnancy. So she was poisoning the batches of food when I was pregnant with my oldest son. And then during that time period, she also took, it was an empty sandwich bag that had the 2 corners missing on the end, took it to Brownstown Police Department where she lives, and told them that I'm doing drugs, and showed them it was basically a piece of garbage, the rest of the sandwich bag, took it to them, told them I'm doing all these drugs and I'm pregnant and blah, blah, blah. She was trying to build a trail of this false narrative, as she already had in the past. And so here she is continuing on. She goes to the police department, shows them this bag. They tell her I'm doing inhalants and my baby's going to come out all fucked up. Except for that's not what I was doing at all. At no time was I on drugs during any of my pregnancies. MJ is not a drug. So we live in Michigan here, where I'm from. That is not a drug. I do not consider that a drug. And there's a lot of people who are going to have a lot of different opinions about this, but I also have 2 adult children, and none of my kids were affected by whatever little bits of MJ that I ingested when I was pregnant with them. So beyond that, that little bag that was actually a piece of trash I was not doing inhalants or any other drugs. What it was is, back then, this was before there was dispensaries and weed was medically legal here in Michigan. What it was is I was selling 20 sacks, and those were the corners that were missing out of that bag. And that the remaining portion was the trash. It must have just been sitting around or didn't make it into the trash, because she was always going through my room every day. She had done that from the time I was a small child. I had no privacy whatsoever. So she took that to the police, and really, I hadn't ingested anything or done anything. I was actually making money. And again, this is before you could easily get that type of product here in Michigan. So that's what they told her. And at no time did anybody even stop to think that the reality of the situation was the reality. And at no time was I on any drugs. But they were all delusional and came up with this whole fake story about how I was on drugs. And she did that for a reason. She went over there and made that report so that way, if the baby had problems when the baby came out, she could say, see, she was on drugs. See, I reported it over here. The reality is she was poisoning batches of food. So the issues I had during pregnancy and some of the issues after the baby was born was because she was poisoning batches of food my entire pregnancy. Not that I ingested all that much of it, because I was already working in the restaurant industry, eating at work. But some of it I did ingest, and it was causing problems. I just did not realize it. It was probably about 10 years from that point that I finally realized what was actually going on there. But she had tried to farm this narrative that I was on these drugs, so that way her poison batches of food that I was ingesting, it wouldn't look like that's what the problem was. It would look like that I did drugs during pregnancy, and that's why the baby has these issues. That's not at all what was going on. So she tried to farm it by taking that little piece of trash over to the police department and trying to prove something that wasn't even happening. And they all got together, oh yeah, that's what she's doing. Oh yeah, that's what she's doing. Like, you're all idiots, because that's not at all what was going on. And these people call themselves cops. So that is something that happened during my pregnancy. And she did it to, help back up why I had this child that had these issues, but none of that had anything to do with it. It did have to do with the poison food, and then it did have to do with something else that happened after the baby was born, and it did happen in front of my face at the doctor's office. So I will talk about this way down the line. I'm nowhere near this playlist or talking about some of the other subjects I have to talk about. I have to get all this other information and all these other situations out there first. Once that's all situated, I will continue on with all of the other knowledge that I have, because I have information the rest of the world needs and does not have. And I have the ability to change the world and change the outcome of humanity and change a lot of lives. So I will be talking about this other stuff down the line. It's just not going to be talked about yet. So that is something else that she did pertaining to the poison food during my pregnancy with my oldest. And yeah, if you want to learn more about the poison batches of food, go to that playlist on YouTube in those several videos. It talks a lot more about it because it would take me numerous more videos if I were to re-explain it in this one. Now, with the portraying me to have the mental disorder and the drug problem, she did that because of the stipulations in that trust that was left for me was if I was incarcerated or if I was deemed mentally incompetent, then she would get to have access to this trust fund. So the first second she thought she could start to incorporate that into her false narrative that was already being grown about me, because she had already been growing it for over 10 years. And then once I was 15, 16, here she tried to incorporate this mental disorder, this drug problem in with the false narrative, because she had already started it off with, I'm just this terrible person, I have bad behavior, I'm known to lie. She started it off with other smaller things and grew it leading up to that point, and then tried to incorporate that in, because then, you know, if she could pull that off on paper or get me admitted somewhere or get it documented on paper that yeah, this is the situation, then she would have gotten to gain access to that trust fund. So that is why she started farming that false narrative initially, and then grew it into that. It grew right into that when I was a teenager, and then kept that part of the false narrative going all these years, all these decades. So nobody knew a couple years after that. I cut all ties with her, went in the opposite direction, was building my own life, had nothing to do with her. There's no contact, there's no relationship. Nobody ever realized that because she kept this whole false narrative going as if we have contact or a relationship or something. She kept the whole false narrative going with hundreds of people all along the way. Talked to them all regularly as if these things she was saying was all real, as if she actually knows something about me. And then she was using my dad to get my older two kids, you know, in her possession. It was actually in my dad's possession. But because they're married, and then she'd tell all these delusions on the phone to people in private with nobody around her, she'd get my dad to pick up my kids, and then they'd all appear at somewhere together, and it would make it look like the false narrative she had been calling people with all along was true, just because they all arrived together. When really my kids I had custody of them the whole time, they lived with me the whole time, and my dad had picked them up to take them wherever they were going together. So she grew that false narrative about the mental disorder and the drug problem all the way. Like I said, I'm 41. That false narrative has been ongoing from the time I was 15, 16 years old, all the way to the current day. She kept it going all along, every step of the way. All these years, it's never stopped. And now I know that what she had done when I bought this house, because I was thinking like, well, that doesn't actually make sense because the house I live in, how does anybody figure that that's real? Well, she had been telling everybody that my ex has been paying my bills and that my dad's been paying my bills all these years. And none of that's ever been real. Everything's 100% mine. Again, self-made, self-built. So here she kept that false narrative going. She incorporated another false narrative about how my bills were paid, about how I make my money, or that I'm just this broke loser who never made it in life, when it's really the exact opposite. And the problems I am having are all these financial problems that have happened along the way. She's been 100% the direct cause of all of them 100% of the time, every step of the way. So now I'm aware that that narrative had never stopped. It continued on all those years. I'm assuming now that I have a certain amount of videos out that people are now realizing that I'm not a mental disorder drug addict. So I don't know. The proof is in the pudding at this point. If you still believe that, then you need to get yourself a mental evaluation as well. So you know, she did all that to gain access to the trust fund is what it was. She was hoping to get something like that on paper. And then by her repeatedly trying to kidnap my kids over the years, because this has happened numerous times, and then by her using my dad to pick up my kids and present them to these family members at these different parties and such, she did that to help back up this false narrative that she had custody of them all along, and I just had these kids and dumped them with her and ran off. She did that so she could gain access to that trust fund which she did for about 20 years fraudulently. That's how she did it. By getting my dad to pick up my 2 older kids, by farming the false narrative in private, not around anybody, making these delusional phone calls to all these hundreds of family members and friends and people, and then having my dad pick up my kids and present them. So all these people, when they see them all together, they believe her false narrative, and then she took whoever agreed to help her, or there could be some written statements or something from any of these people who believed her false narrative, and then she took it to the attorney's office and fraudulently gained access to this trust fund with them believing I'm really this mental disorder drug addict who had these kids and ran off and ditched them with her. That's why there's no legal paperwork for her to actually have custody, because it's all fake. That's not real. But her excuse to them was because I just had them and dumped them off and ran off because I'm a mental disorder drug addict. And so that's how she was able to pull that off. And that's the reason for all of that, and the reason for the repeated kidnappings of my kids all those years, and the wipeouts and destroying my life and kidnapping my kids, keeping the chaos ongoing, and it just goes on and on and on and on. Each escapade goes on for months at a time. And she's able to pull that off. She was doing that so that it's backup supporting documentation to say, no, see, we have custody. Oh, see, I need more money for them because see, they're here with us. And it's supporting documentation for her to take and say, oh, no, see. Like, no, she caused all those situations, and she was repeatedly criminally kidnapping my kids. And the Brownstown Police Department has helped her in this matter numerous times. They are all responsible for these kidnappings and the problems that have come out of it, and why my daughter is not graduated from high school at 20 years old. They are all responsible. She stayed truant for 1.5 years. I don't know any police department that is going to allow a mouthy teenager to run shit and stay truant and go against the only parent that she has, the only parent's rules, and then allow the deranged granny to kidnap her and let her stay truant for 1.5 years. I've never seen that a day in my life. There's not another case of that in history where that's been allowed to happen. So all of these people are responsible for that situation. And currently they're all walking around free, and nobody's been charged for the crimes they committed just in that situation. That's not including the other crimes that were going on at the same time as that. Because there's more. So I'll get to that in other videos. But like I said, the Munchausen by proxy is criminal because she's using agencies and other people to help her harass, commit crimes, carry out a false narrative, carry out this false narrative about me having a mental disorder and a drug problem, because it's all to gain access to this trust fund. And she's using these people to help her. These are crimes. This is not just Munchausen by proxy. These are criminal actions as well. So all of that is tied together, and why all of that has happened. Now, the other thing with the causing the physical, mental, and emotional pain and suffering, prior to, like I said, she started the false narrative before the mental disorder and the drug problem. She started it off smaller with, I just have this bad behavior, I'm known to lie, and this and that. She started it off, from the time the trust fund was left for me in the late 1980s, all the way to that point of me being 15, 16 years old, and her starting that false narrative. The smaller version of the false narrative was, I'm a liar and I'm a thief and I do all these things and I just have really bad behavior. And then she'd call each teacher every school year. She would call each teacher in advance and try to talk to them and try to manipulate them on her team to harass me and act as if this false narrative about me was really who I was as a person. And she would tell each teacher this every year. And some of them would jump on board and harass me as well. So it caused mental and emotional pain and suffering because I was being harassed by some of these teachers who were also narcissists. And then I'd go home and deal with it. And I was under their full control. I didn't have anywhere to turn to for help. I didn't have living grandparents. I don't have siblings. I didn't have any close family members. I wasn't allowed to go to many people's houses. And so my day consisted of struggling through each day at school with the teachers harassing me with the false narrative they were giving, and then going home and dealing with it continuously. Like I said, I lived in survival mode, walking on eggshells, in fight or flight mode and from the time I was born all the way to the time I got into my own house at age 18. So I do believe that plays a role in why I was missing all these memories from that time period. So around age 18 to 21, I lost like 3 years worth of memories, and I never remembered losing any memories, but I do believe that that plays a role in why. So yes, it initially started as a smaller version of this false narrative about me. And that went on every second of every day, each school year, each day. I was having a problem each day. So I'd be in a constant state of like mental and emotional suffering, because here I was being harassed and the teachers were just acting like I was lying because that's what she was telling them about me, when that wasn't real. And I would tell them, no, she's lying. And they believed her because she's the mother. And that's what she would say all the time. Everyone always believes the mother. And she's laughing like a deranged lunatic, just the way she's saying it. So you can tell that this is all intentional. This is all 100% intentional. And the way she would say that to me, that's what she was doing behind the scenes. She didn't say to me that's what she was doing behind the scenes. It didn't take me very long to figure out, because then these teachers would pull me aside and tell me that she said this or that. And after so many years of this, then it was very clear that that's what was going on. That's why I was having all these problems at school, and why the teachers would always harass me, because she was calling them and telling them things that were not real. That's where it all started initially. So eventually, once I was a teenager, then it kind of looks like I have a mental disorder, when it's really abuse and harassment, and it's the teachers doing it at my mother's direction. And then when I go home, I'm dealing with it as well. So that went on the entire time, all the way until I got into my own home at 18. But, you know, any situation along the way that happened, for her to insert herself, you know, anything she could insert herself in, if anything happened, doesn't matter what it is. If I got arrested for something, if there's a problem over here, a problem over there, if she'd be trying to get me fired from different places I've worked as well. So she would cause problems wherever she found a way to insert herself. That's what she was doing. Just like during the Ford gas leak in 2021, where my house sits in Flat Rock, same thing. She inserted herself in that situation, called to the city, called to the top of Ford. These people told on themselves. They reached out to Charmaine directly, told on themselves with the information they were told by my deranged mother. Here they delivered it right back to Charmaine. So now we know who told. Now we know where they got their information from, because she called Charmaine and told on her and themselves. But the whole point of that was to finish me off, because of the already existing medical emergency that I was already living in, the ongoing daily treatment that I was already under, still treating the initial medical emergency, had just barely crossed the first threshold when all of that happened. Still in a very fragile place, still my brain tissue wide open, still pretty overloaded with carbon monoxide, can't take in particles of any kind, no chemicals, no toxins, particles of any kind. It doesn't just have to be carbon monoxide. So when all of that happened to me, her intent was to make sure that I did not survive that incident. And I did not almost survive. There were several times during that time, it was like a year period, where I almost did not make it. And it was due to her delusional phone call placing, getting all those people at the city and Ford to believe that I have this mental disorder and this drug problem, and my son and I were never injured, and I made everything up. And because I was in so much chaos and it was an emergency, I was running all over the place, barely keeping us alive. Because the liquid gasoline had spread, they'd flushed it so far out, because this is like the second month in. So by the time this was all happening, it had been flushed to such a wide radius that I had to keep running further and further out, and we nearly did not make it. So I could not take their phone calls, get us to the treatment center to barely clear what we were taking in from time to time during this. And then they're calling me, the people from the city and Ford, they're calling me and harassing me and screaming, like demeaning things to me over the phone, acting as if I really have this mental disorder and this drug problem, acting as if our injuries are not real. I could not get to the different providers that I had, couldn't even get there to get proper documentation to submit to these people. Then a year later, I find in my email that they're trying to work with me on my situation, wanting this documentation and that. No, this is a medical emergency that I had been in for years. I was barely holding on, barely keeping things running. I barely crossed that first threshold. I never even found the email for an additional year. So when that gas spilled, it was extreme chaos. I was barely keeping us alive. I had to focus on keeping us alive. I was not checking emails. This was not some leisure incident. So they were acting like I was just leisurely laying around at this hotel they're paying for. No, we're having to jump hotels. We're having to drive further out because they're lying to the public about the gas particles being contained. They're lying about flushing it everywhere. I ended up an hour away. And they were just acting like what I was going through wasn't what I was going through. And then they completely cut our hotel off at my mother's, from her false narrative of calling and telling them these delusions. It then forced us home to live with our brains bleeding in and out of consciousness, where we nearly died several times. And it was her doing, because that was her intent, because then she would get to collect on the rest of the trust fund. That's what she was going for. She also used that to kidnap my daughter. That was the start of her being truant. She used that entire incident to blow my life into little tiny pieces. So it caused all these problems. That's what forced me to buy the home I have in Ohio, due to all of that. And that should have never happened. I should have never been forced from this home at all. That's what caused the damage to this home, the over $100,000 in damage, because I put tenants in it temporarily for 1 year. It was known in advance they wouldn't be here more than 2 years, 1 to 2 years. We all knew in advance. And they did all of that damage in 1 year flat. So like I said, all the current problems I have are fallout from all this harassment, the ongoing crimes, the false narrative, the delusional phone call placing. That is the fallout that I'm still currently dealing with because of all of that. Yeah, so that's a lot of what's on my plate. But the whole reason for it was to make sure that I did not survive. So she did nearly get away with that. And then also during that gas leak, before it spread, further out, in the very beginning of the gas leak, there was an attempted capital M on my life, and she did it. She got caught red-handed in the act. So I did a video on that as well. I believe I released that video in May, just before Mother's Day, and it's labeled, it's on the YouTube channel. It's labeled, Mommy Dearest has gotten away with numerous attempted capital M's, I believe is the label for it. But if you look by date when it was released, it was just before Mother's Day. So that is where I talk about that incident and what she did during that time. She did get caught in the act. Her intent was to make sure I did not survive. And if my phone had not gone off at the top of the steps, I was charging a phone at the top of the steps. So everything, I talk about all this in this video, so you can go watch this video where she gets caught in the act, and then the police refuse to take the report because they're in on the crimes with her, because they're also taking bribery payments from this trust fund to help carry out the harassment and the crimes against me. But if that text had not gone off, I would have not lived. She would have gotten away with it. At that time, with how fragile I was at that time and what had happened and the amount of carbon monoxide I would have taken in the time period it would have happened in, I would not have survived it. So if you go watch that video as well, it talks about that specific incident because she has gotten away with numerous counts of capital M against myself and my dad. So those other videos I was talking about, my dad's injury and more on Special Tree and the care facility and his injury. So several of those videos all back to back are talking about all of this. But there was numerous attempts on his life as well. And she was caught. Like, I caught her doing it. I even made police reports in advance of some of these. And Charmaine has also documented some of these incidences in advance that I was calling in advance of what she was doing, because I know exactly how she operates. So all of those videos, you can view those fully on the YouTube channel. I will be posting them to TikTok at some point once I catch everything up. Still, it's better understood if you go to the YouTube channel. So it talks about all of those because her intent for both of us was to not survive so she can take the assets from both of us and then run off. So yeah, that is part of that. And hold on one second. Okay. I keep having to pause these last couple of videos I filmed. I've had to pause quite a bit. But I guess, so to keep this all condensed into just 2 videos for this subject, I'm just going to go into talking about, what was the last one, pertaining to the Munchausen by proxy. Okay, yeah, withholding medical treatment. So for me, she withholds medical treatment for me when it comes to the Munchausen by proxy. With my dad, it's more about gaining the attention for the injuries she's creating for him because he is getting care at a care facility and at a hospital. It's a little different for him. She's not withholding treatment, but she has withheld his pain medication to create further pain and suffering. And she did insert herself with numerous different staff members, and she was doing it during the different transfers of the different facilities he'd be at. She was pulling staff members aside and telling him that he doesn't take his pain medication, or he only takes half of it or a quarter of it. She was doing that so that way he would suffer in physical pain. And I caught on to that at some point along the way after it happened numerous times. I caught on to what she was doing with him. But other than that, he does get the care at the facilities. He is receiving treatment. So she gains attention off of her poisoning the batches of food, him, getting rushed back to the hospital, and she knows they're not going to find whatever substance in his system. But she gains the attention off of her acting like this doting wife. And really, she wasn't even around for the first couple months of his injury. She was plotting on how to finish him off. And you could clearly see her odd behavior the first several months of his injury. Charmaine also documented that. With him, she causes the injury. She gains attention off of him, being so sick again, or going downhill, or having these other issues. She created all of those issues from the time his injury occurred, and led to him being permanently blind. She caused all of that. So if you watch all those videos like I was talking about on the YouTube channel, it will talk about all of those in depth. But with him, he does receive treatment, and she creates the problem to happen, and then he is receiving treatment, but she's gaining the attention off of, poor me, my husband, this happened to me again and again. No, she's causing it. So with me, she does withhold medical treatment, which is exactly why my son and I were left with no treatment in an extreme medical emergency when it initially became an extreme medical emergency in January of 2018. She was the one who caused all that to happen. And then she did it numerous times throughout that first year or so, where here we were still trying to seek treatment, and she was pulling different staff members aside, giving them false information about me. They would enter it into my medical file and operate against me on that false information, seeing her hospital employee badge hanging from her neck, believing everything she's saying as soon as she says she's my mother. They enter the false information into my medical file. Which has happened numerous times. And then that false information still follows me to this day. There's still ongoing problems because of that false information. So then even today, even though she doesn't work in the medical system anymore, she retired almost 6 years ago, the problems are still ongoing from that. I'm still not being given treatment when I'm suffering ongoing effects, like I explained in the beginning of this video, from my initial injury. If I end up back at the hospital, I'm still left with no treatment because of those initial false statements. And she usually, like I said, she usually uses others to enter the false information so her hands stay clean, just like how she places delusional phone calls to different people and agencies, and they operate against me on it. Her hands aren't directly tied to the situation. It's other people carrying it out for her. Same with the falsified medical records and the withholding of the treatment, because those false statements are now following me. And because that initial statement came from my mother, their employee, it's extremely credible to them. So here, like I said in the last couple of videos, I was brought back there into that hospital system. Even though it's not the exact same hospital, they still see the false information, operate on it. I'm still not being given treatment. That's how we ended up patients at the private center for those 6 years that we treated. That's how we got to live. I self-paid at the private center. So yes, she withholds the medical treatment. It does create extreme physical pain, mental and emotional pain as well, because with our situation, it went on for 3 years in an extreme manner. So once it's going on day in and day out with no relief, and the people around you are harassing you and causing problems and screaming delusions, especially when you can't have sound, and those injuries were brain injuries and very extreme ones, and then the people around me were being controlled and manipulated by her, it was creating a very extreme situation, because then you're in extreme fight or flight mode, unable to even communicate properly, in an extreme state of physical suffering, just trying to get to and from treatment, just trying to stay alive. And there's no relief, no comfortability, no rest, no recovery, nothing but extreme chaos and harassment and screaming going on. That went on for 3 years, but she was at the root of why all that occurred. So yeah, when it comes to withholding medical treatment, that was a very extreme incident. Prior to me becoming injured, I didn't have a medical history as an adult. So from 18 to 34, I didn't have a medical history at all. I didn't even have a primary doctor. So she wouldn't have been able to insert herself or manipulate any time prior to that injury in 2018 because there was nowhere for her to insert herself. Now, when I was younger and in school, she also withheld medical treatment and I was not allowed to be sick. So if I was sick, she would send me to school anyway. I wasn't allowed to have a runny nose. I wasn't allowed to have a cold. I wasn't allowed to have the flu. I wasn't allowed to miss school. She would send me there to suffer anyway. So with me, it's opposite what is going on with my dad. My dad actually receives care, but she's the one poisoning and causing the problems and the incidences to happen to him. Whereas with me, the treatment is being withheld to create physical pain and suffering as well, but in a different manner by withholding the treatment. So same thing when I was younger, she was causing the problems by withholding treatment, causing physical pain and suffering. So that did happen quite a bit as I was growing up. Again, no medical history for like a solid, 16 years or so until I became injured. And now the ongoing effects of her lying and manipulating and falsifying medical records or getting others to do it. And that all still being in my medical file, it's still an ongoing problem because of the ongoing effects my son and I suffer from. We can easily just drive from point A to point B, and I can have an extreme incident where I'm unconscious, or like how I was deceased on the floor at Walmart, bleeding from the head in the summer of 2023, then brought to that hospital, where I was then kicked out onto the street because of the false information that's in the medical file, how many times they have covered this up, how I was initially left without treatment, all those times I initially sought treatment, and then them believing their employee, this deranged lunatic, and nobody even ever confirming or consulting with my actual care team or the center I was treating at or my primary doctor or Charmaine. Every time I was brought back there, I offered them the information to speak to somebody from my care team, and they refused every single time. So that is all stemming from the false information that is within my medical file within their hospital system, that she is responsible for getting that information in there. So the effects are ongoing. I don't foresee this changing. And yeah, those are the different forms of the Munchausen that she has. And it's created ongoing problems every step of the way. There's been ongoing harassment and crimes every step of the way as well. So I am going to come back and do kind of like a timeline order of events of the different stages of the harassment and how it grew to the extreme degree of where it is today, because it all is intertwined with my injury as well. Because I'm self-made, self-built, I generate 100% of my own income. I run everything. So being sick and injured, it's not really compatible with somebody who has that much going on in their life. However, I will never be able to work for somebody else ever again, and I have no choice but to carry out what I already built previous to my injury occurring to that degree. So I will do a timeline of events on how it got so extreme and where it is today, because I am having all of these problems in the current, and it is due to the harassment, the crimes, the Munchausen by proxy, all of it. It's a mix of all of it, and how injured I am also plays a role in all of that as well. So I'll be back with more. Thanks. Bye.